Hello, friends. Welcome to our last day of Bible 12 before we head off to Easter break. Hope you're enjoying the rain. It's probably raining right now because now is tomorrow for me. So today there's three main things you got to do. One is that warm up. Get that warm up done. It's a discussion on forgiveness. It should be filed under warmups /8 forgiveness. And then watch this lecture, which you are. And then there's a chapter summary notes thing. You should be super used to these by now. And an exit ticket at the end. Quick thing. I realized that Jaden also wrote a thing on chapter 9, and for some reason, just the way I had my files sorted, I forgot to post that one also. But Jaden's summary was amazing. You should have read it, but I didn't post it. So sorry, everyone. So chapter 10 is what we're going to dive in today, and chapter 10 is on forgiveness. So let's just go ahead and go to the PowerPoint, and then we'll do this thing. So, three questions that you should have answered or are going to answer for the warm-up is, one, should we forgive people that have wronged us, even if they are not repentant? Two, when should people be forgiven? Like, should they be forgiven right away? Should we wait? Should we wait for something to happen before we forgive? When should people be forgiven? And number three, what does it practically look like to forgive? Because I think forgiveness is one of those things that we say a lot, but what happens when forgiveness happens? What is forgiveness after all? So I want you to really interact with those three questions. After you've done that warm-up, I want you to just jump right into that chapter summary and read what Ellie had to say about Sacred Marriage, chapter 10. The chapter is called Falling Forward, so like always, highlight at least three important things that you notice and put a star next to what you think is the thesis. So everybody go ahead and go into assignments. I believe it's called chapter 10 summary notes. Go into assignments, find that, annotate, and resubmit now. Pause and go do it. Okay, good. The chapter is called Falling Forward. I'm not sure this came through 100% clear just from the chapter summary because there's a lot to cover in the chapter. But the reason the chapter is called Falling Forward is because, kind of like I have in this image, when people are in a relationship with each other, they're facing each other, right? And the reality is that one of them, or really both of them, will fall at some point. And falling, I guess using this metaphor, falling is like when we fail, when we sin, when we wrong the other person, when we fall short of what that other person deserves, or when we fall short of the type of person that God wants us to be. And when we fall, we have two options, right? Since we're facing each other, when we fall, falling can be something that moves us away from people, and so we fall backwards away from the relationship, or we can use those failures, and the person who has experienced the sin, who has been wronged by the other person, we can use those as an opportunity to fall forward into each other. Instead of allowing failures to push us apart, where this person falls away and creates extra distance in the relationship, creates extra space, creates separation, allowing your trust in your commitment in the relationship to be the thing that supports you so that when you do fall, you fall into the other person. I'm not sure that you've had enough relationships in your life to realize this, but at least in my life, it's worked out that both in friendships, in marriage, in family, that it's the times where a failure occurs. If that failure is navigated well, if restoration and reconciliation is sought after, it's usually on the other side of that greater intimacy and greater connection occurs. And so it's through the process of learning to fall intentionally into each other. Now, don't fall intentionally, but when you do fall, to have the discipline to say, I'm going to fall into that other person. Now, with forgiveness, I think that there's some other areas that we kind of need to hunt around in. Those of you who are in my Bible 10 class, this might look familiar to you. But this quote has always stuck with me. It's that unforgiveness is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Especially in cases where the other person is the unrepentant type, where they don't really care. You holding on to that grudge and that bitterness, if you think about it, it's not hurting them, right? When you stay bitter, when you stay upset, when you stay angry at that other person, you're probably not actually doing them any harm. And in our hearts, I think that that's what we think. We're like, oh, I'm going to get them by holding this grudge. But all it does is it distorts what you're experiencing in your own soul. And they probably don't give a rip, right? Like they probably don't care um, that you feel upset about this thing. And so unforgiveness, like when we choose to not forgive, when we resent, when we hold on to grudges, I think sometimes we think it's a weapon that we can use against that other person, but realistically, like all it does is end up like infecting our own souls. It's like drinking poison, like thinking, oh, this other person's going to die, but all it does is infect and make ourselves more toxic. And in the Bible, there is this story of the unforgiving servant, which I'll give you the Reader's Digest version of it. Um, there is a master, and this master is owed a ridiculous sum. I believe last time I did the math, it was something like $2 billion. Like, so this servant owes the master $2 billion, and he begs and he says, "Master, I'll pay it back." Which, like, no way, you can't pay back $2 billion. Especially if you get $2 billion in debt, you probably don't have the means to pay it off. Um, and so the master says, "Fine, I'll forgive you." But then this servant goes and then talks to his buddy who owes him $2,000, the equivalent of $2,000, and says, "Hey, pay me back, or I'll throw you in jail." And the guy's like, "Hey, have mercy on me. I'll pay you back as soon as I can." And then the servant who was just forgiven $2 billion says, "No, I won't forgive you for the $2,000," and throws the guy into prison. Naturally, the Lord who originally forgave the debt was furious and threw this guy into the outer darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth in typical Jesus style. But I think what this lesson shows us is that our reference point for forgiveness should be God. Our reference point for wondering, man, can I forgive this person is, man, can God forgive me? And if God can forgive me, then the ultimate debts that I owe the divine, like which hopefully leading up to Easter, these things are on your mind a little bit more. If God can forgive me of those debts, then how much more can I forgive the little debts that other people accrue against me? And so that being said, I think having that as our reference point should be the thing that like frames like in all of our relationships, when our parents wrong us, when our siblings wrong us, when we feel like someone snubs us on the internet. I think that we remember in our mind the $2 billion debt that we've been forgiven, and we extend that forgiveness to them for two reasons. One, we know that God has forgiven us, and two, we know that by not forgiving them, it doesn't actually help us, and it doesn't hurt them usually. Forgiveness, obviously, it's super important, but then sometimes I think that gets oversimplified, and then people use phrases like this: forgive and forget. Do you think that this phrase is always the best way to go? Think about it. Forgive and forget. Now, I think that even if this phrase has a lot of sentiment, and there's probably some goodness to it if we unpack it, I think if this phrase can then be like weaponized by people who are unrepentant, right? Because I think forgive and forget, if we take it too literally, then it's like forgive and enable. Forgive and don't remember that this person has a tendency to do evil things. And so let's continue to victimize ourselves to them. Because the truth is that some people are toxic. Like if there is a person who is manipulative and abusive toward you, and you forgive and forget, then what you're going to do is you're going to continually expose yourself to their manipulative, abusive tendencies. Now, don't get me wrong. I think that you can forgive a person, even if they're manipulative and abusive. But what I don't think is that you need to then, therefore, put that completely out of your mind and not remember that the thing happened. I think that when bad things happen to us, whether they're like just in general, like an illness, or when it's someone else harming us, I think it's our responsibility as humans to learn from those things. Now, this doesn't mean to use that as a way of like becoming more corrupt and more callous and less trusting of people, but rather to be honest about the state of humanity, right? And realize that some people um, have habits of making consistent decisions to hurt. And after you've been hurt by a person consistently, um, and they seem unrepentant, I think, yes, we do the work in our own hearts to release, to let go, to forgive. But that doesn't mean to continue allowing them to harm, to be that toxic person. You can forgive them, but you don't have to continue drinking their poison, right? Another way of putting this is like by exposing yourself to that other person consistently, sometimes what you're doing is enabling them. I think that this is why Jesus, when he talks about divorce in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, like everything else he's so rigid on with like lust, cut out your eye and cut off your hand. But when it comes to divorce, he provides an exception and says, except for unfaithfulness. Because I think when you're in a relationship, he recognizes that with that other person, if they are unrepentant, if they are unfaithful, then you continuing to be in the relationship with them and allowing them to continue to violate your trust sometimes is not even loving of you. Yeah, maybe forgiving, but by allowing and enabling another person to continue in their sin, that might be a very unloving thing to do. By allowing another person to continue to hit you, think about what you're doing to their soul by permitting them to continue to do that and convincing them that it might be okay. And so this is why we need to define forgiveness really, really well. And while I think we can like Google things and look up definitions, I think that forgiveness is not necessarily forgetting. Forgiveness is not saying, I don't remember that thing anymore. But what forgiveness does is it says, hey, I'm not going to use that thing and hold it against you. I'm not going to hold that deed against you. I'm not going to hold on to a grudge. I'm not going to relive the pain and anger that I feel about that thing toward you. Because if that's our perspective, then what that means is, like, we can learn from what happened in the past, but then still have love be the guiding emotion. Love be the guiding, I guess, decision for how we interact with that person. Which is why I would say that, like, if they are abusive or if they are prone to addictions that are harmful to you, then sometimes the most loving thing and the most forgiving thing you could do is to say, hey, we need to create some space so that you can get healthy, right? So that being said, we need to then, if we're like, okay, well, some personality traits are toxic, well, then we better come up with a list of some of these personality traits. So really quickly, I want you to pause this video and write out like 4 or 5 traits that you're like, these are toxic personality traits that could destroy a marriage. Pause now. I'll restart in 3 seconds. Cool. Hopefully you have your list. Or maybe it's just in your brain. But when I come up with a list, these are some of the things that I think of. I think that a sense of entitlement can be really toxic. I think that chronic selfishness can be destructive to a marriage. I think that even insecurity in a relationship can destroy a relationship. If they're just not a good listener, meaning like when you express yourself and want to like solve problems and work things out, they just don't listen to you. If they hold grudges, if they're not forgiving themselves and they consistently bring up the ways that you harmed them, or maybe like the last chapter we talked about on Monday, they're just flat out inconsiderate. They just don't think about you and they don't care. You might have some other things on your list, but I would say that a lot of these things can be super toxic. But then I want you to think about yourself. Have you acted, or do you act entitled sometimes? Are you selfish sometimes? Do any of you struggle with insecurity? Do you, are you not a really good listener sometimes? Do you hold grudges sometimes? Have you been inconsiderate? I think these personality traits can be toxic and destructive to a relationship, but then, like, how often do we embody those personality traits? And the reason I want to bring this up is because I think sometimes we can use our list of like, this is a toxic personality trait, and instead of like, authentically thinking, what's the most loving thing and most loving way that I can forgive and work with this person towards making them holy. Instead, we use this checklist as a way of saying, cool, they didn't meet my standards, they're toxic, let's divorce. Let's end the relationship. Let me move out. Let me ask for a new roommate. Let me stop being friends with this person. Um, and I think that sometimes it's just really short-sighted when we do this kind of thing. So here's what I want you to do. Here's, if you Google junior hires, this is what you get. I don't know who these people are, but their image is on the internet, so it must be okay. Exit ticket 4/8. I want you to think. The first thing I want you to do, you could even do this as we're working right now, as you're watching this right now, first thing I want you to do is describe yourself in 7th grade. What were you like in 7th grade? At least 5 character traits or so. What are some things that were super important to you? What was your personality like? What was your character like? What were you into? Who did you hang out with? What did you talk like? What did you think of yourself? That kind of stuff. So go ahead and jot down some of those notes. After you do that, I then want you to think, okay, number 2 is explain how you've changed or stayed the same in some of those traits. Are you still like that 7th grader in some ways? Are you radically different in some ways? My hope would be that yes, you are radically different in some really important ways. Number 3, after looking at 1 and 2, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 5 years. It's been 5 years since you were that 7th grader. And think about how much you've changed. Do you think that when you go from being a senior to 1 year out of college, you'll go through some changes? Or what about 1 year out of college to 5 years into your career? Or what about newlywed to married for 5 years? Or what about married for 5 years to having kids for 5 years? Like, the truth is that change never stops. We are continually becoming different people, which means that we're continually picking up new character traits. We're continually morphing and adjusting our personality as we grow. And so this is what I want you to think of. In choosing a spouse, what is the most important thing to make sure it doesn't change? Either about yourself, what's a character trait that you need to make sure that you have that does not change? And what's a character trait that the other person needs to make sure that they have that doesn't change? Because their taste in music is going to change. Even their ability to be a patient human being is probably going to change. Their ability to do different things is going to change. Their looks are going to change. Their talents and abilities are going to change. So think about it. What is important to not change, right? Because when we talk about what is marriage material, we want to know what is that thing that can't change. And I'll give you mine. You don't have to steal my answer. You might have a better answer than me. But I would say, in my experience, the one thing that needs to not change is a commitment to growth. Because if that person is committed to growth, or if we want to use more spiritual terminology, a commitment to holiness, if that person is committed to growing, then even as they change, you know that as they navigate those changes, that they are committed to becoming a better person, a better spouse for you, a better follower of Jesus. Whereas if they don't have that commitment to growth, then you don't know where that change is always going to go. Like, none of us knows where the change is going to go, but at least if you have this commitment to become better people, then you know that change can be leveraged as a tool to make your marriage better. It's almost like the theme or the thesis of the book. Maybe marriage wasn't necessarily to make us happy, but to make us holy. And if your partner is committed to that process towards holiness, towards becoming a better human being, then you know that you have marriage material. Because all of those quirks, all of those personality defects, all of those things, they're going to work on them till they die, right? So make sure you find someone that is committed to growth. And so that's how we're going to wrap up today. Sorry, something got cut off. I just have a couple of announcements really quick. And those announcements should be here in Canvas. 2 things. 1, last time we were together, I posted an assignment that has to do with budgets. I think I've gotten 2 views on YouTube, which means that a lot of you have not seen them. So I'm going to go ahead and say that you need to make sure that you watch the video and follow along. So if you have a phone, maybe watch the video on your phone and follow along on your iPad, because what that's going to do, um, learning to budget is what it's called. What that's going to do is explain to you how to do the budget portion of your project. And I'm going to actually walk you through using all of these tools and some of these websites and things. It says link to be posted, but it's right here. Sorry. Cool. Oh no, it's streaming. Weird. Okay. And then last on the lesson plan, yes, we are going to have a final memory verse, and there's going to be 3 different ways that you can do it. One, you can set up a Zoom appointment with me. You can show me what the room that you're taking this in so that I can know that you're not cheating. You can show me where your phone is and where you're going to leave it face down, and then you can say your verse to me. The other option is that you can video record yourself saying the verse, but I will require you to wear a blindfold or put your hand over your eyes the entire time to show that you're doing it from memory, and not just reading something off screen. The other option is, because of writing, I know that I apologize / don't apologize, because I think memorizing scripture is important. Because of the written thing, there's no way that I can ensure that you're not cheating. And so here's the option for written. If you hand write it 15 times and take pictures of those 15 handwritten versions of it, then I will just give you 100% on this memory verse. The reason I picked 15 is because I felt like 20 was too much, and did a little bit of research, and it kind of seems like 20 times is what it would take for it to really stick in your brain long term. So I shaved 5 off so that you don't get hand cramps too much. And you can work on this over time, but handwritten 15 different times, not on Notability because I know that you can copy and paste, not typed because it doesn't do the same thing in your brain chemistry, or biology, I suppose. So those are your 3 options. Set up a Zoom appointment with me, video with your eyes covered, or handwritten on paper. So that's how we'll do verse quizzes, and those will be due the 24th, which is the Friday after we come back from break. So make sure you got 1 Corinthians 13 sealed into your brain. And I think that's all we got. Now I'm going to click stop recording for reals. Have a wonderful Easter, everyone.